Welcome to a special bonus edition of the Monocle Daily on Monocle Radio, brought to you in association with the University of Warwick. For 60 years, the University of Warwick has been championing curiosity, collaboration, and the transformational power of knowledge. As a global hub for research and discovery, the British institution tackles the world's pressing challenges with clarity and purpose. Now, Monocle invited its readers to pose the big questions that they wanted answering. In this special programme, the University of Warwick's renowned academics offer insight on topics shaping the world today, making sense of everything from artificial intelligence to the economics of luxury. Today, we're talking politics. One Monocle reader posed a question to Elena Korosteleva, Professor of Politics and Global Sustainable Development. They asked Elena to discuss whether she thinks we've shifted from a soft to a much harder power geopolitical environment. Let's hear from her now. She was talking to Monocle's Mitch Parker.
So hard and soft power environment, and whether we're in that kind of hard environment today. In answering this question, to be honest, I just find this binary and dichotomous understanding of the world through the lens of hard and soft power a bit difficult, in fact, if not obsolete and unhelpful. I think it might have been perhaps useful to use this kind of soft, hard power binaries maybe in the 20th century, when we were exposed to, to this kind of massive wars like World War II especially, when obviously the hard power, I think, was kind of manifesting, in all its kind of action and glory, if one could say that. But even then, I think it was very speedily superseded by the idea that no one could win in that kind of hard power arranged world. And what, if anything, what is needed is that kind of global dialogue and global institutions that could help us negotiate, navigate, and work collaboratively together to advance towards a more peaceful and sustainable world. And of course, then subsequently all these institutions emerged and we have the United Nations and so on. But of course, unfortunately, the world is not standing still. And I think that's where we keep losing the focus, that change is always out there. And that's why I think hard, soft power framing is a bit difficult today, because I think the world has changed so much. And we need, especially as academics, we need to try and find different lengths and different framing and different understanding how we should actually approach the world and understand it, and help this world then, to continue developing, evolving into kind of the right direction of travel. And I think this world is now different to the world we contemplated back in the 20th century. Some call it VUCA world. I don't know if you've come across this particular word. It's the abbreviation standing for the world becoming increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Basically, the message is the world is so fast in its growth development, and it's so complex that we cannot either control it, be it by hard or soft means of power. We cannot even predict it. And therefore, we need to find different means to understand it and then to endeavor to govern it in a more sustainable way.
I remember seeing a talk by an academic who works in kind of like military response kind of stuff, talking about how a lot of people think the world is quite different right now, but really it's just the realization that we had a certain idea about how the world looked that was very much post-World War II. And then now that structure has kind of fallen away, and we're just kind of dealing with the idea that we are just like super fractured. And that if anything, people think the world was always like that, but it was really just post-World War II that we had that kind of like very set structure. And it's only now that we're kind of realizing, well, that's kind of gone. And before that, we didn't have it either.
Just going back to that, even, with the European Union back in 2016, obviously that's one, of course, frictions, and the Crimea happened thanks to Russian actions. But even then, the European Union devised this global strategy which reflected on what they call the 3C world, the world which is more kind of connected, complex, and contested. So essentially trying to grapple with the idea, if we live in that kind of fractured, fragile, fragmented world, which is very complex, but interconnected. So let's say if somewhere, in Ukraine and in Crimea, things are going wrong, then it will invariably affect us. So we need to start thinking about it in a different, more connected way. The same with planetary challenges, floods in Valencia or fires in Los Angeles. They all affect us one way or another because it's all about sustaining life on the planet. We're all in the same boat, so to speak.
So talking about having to work together in this kind of new global perspective on things, are there any kind of organizations or bodies or countries in particular that are kind of starting to recognize that, any examples that we can give of kind of this new way of thinking, or is it all still kind of up for discussion at the moment?
That's a very interesting question in terms of, are there kind of actors, agents, countries that are potentially kind of embracing the idea that this VUCA world needs more kind of collaborative way of thinking? I would say yes and no. We slowly realize that the structures that we've put in place in order to keep this world more or less kind of functioning together, international structures, global structures like the United Nations or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe or NATO for that matter, they realize that although while they're still there, they're not really kind of fulfilling their full potential because the world has moved on. So in a way, I think we're at that stage and that kind of cusp point, or maybe crossroads, if you like, where we need to kind of maybe pause a little bit and rethink where we need to go and what structures we need. The world, it's not multipolar, when we're going back in the 20th century, when we have these two poles with the Soviet Union at one end and the United States at the other end, kind of holding the whole world balanced together by threat, hard politics, or vice versa. And then one country disappearing and then the whole world is becoming unipolar. So basically everyone is kind of hanging and hooking on that pole of attraction. That does not longer work. And what I think we need to understand is the world today, in all its kind of vulnerability, complexity, ambiguity, and so on, is becoming very crowded with all these different actors and agents. So the world no longer belongs to the states. And that's what I'm trying to say, that the politics is often now made by multinational actors, which drive the idea of, different orders, the way we kind of rally together around the idea of, be it either liberal order, world order, or be it non-liberal world, but not in derogative way, because what underpins order is the kind of the normative basis, what we believe in. So if we are living in a multi-order world, I think the three things that we need to acknowledge here is that it's less about the state politics. For example, the green movement that was created by Greta Thunberg was, I think, a beautiful illustration that in terms of kind of addressing planetary challenges, for example, we can no longer be confined by the kind of resources and powers of the state. It goes well beyond the state because it affects all of us. And it's the same here with war in Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine. It is not just about Ukraine. It's about ontological security of Europe. It's about ontological security of people around the world. Because, for example, like that grain crisis that happened, it affected everyone. It caused hunger in Africa. It created energy deficiencies in Europe and so on. So it's a ripple effect around the world. So multi-order world is essentially less about states. It's about the gentile power of various actors that emerge. And it is important to understand what they stand for and how we can cohabit and co-work together. The second one is the idea of many worlds. And I think that's something that we're still here to embrace and understand, that it's not the world just simply about this kind of international liberal order. And therefore, everyone else should align to that kind of leading example of international liberal order. Not at all. I think we need to recognize that there are so many different orders and we need to be respectful of them and try to understand the kind of the rationale. And in this sense, the world is not becoming more fragmented. No, I think it's not that. I think we're just seeing basically that the world is becoming more diverse. And I think recognition of diversity then would allow us to become more inclusive in terms of what structures we need in order to manage all that diversity. And I think the third thing that I was going to mention here, when we come to the idea of this multi-order world, it is kind of bottom-up driven, and where we need a new way of thinking about this world. And that's where resilience, the concept that I work with, becomes really center stage. The genteel power of communities. And once communities, which rally around specific order, when they come together to self-organize, that kind of order and arrangement of order becomes far more sustainable. Ukraine is a perfect example. Belarus, a democratic Belarus that was expelled by the authoritarian regime of Lukashenko there, it lost its territory. It was pushed out of the state. But it managed to kind of, well dispersed around the world, it managed to organize itself into a virtual community. That's what I find absolutely amazing, into a virtual community of like-minded individuals who still cherish and seek and support and fight for the idea of a democratic Belarus. And they've created the whole range of institutions for a democratic Belarus without having their state per se. So it's civil society that moved out, but it continues kind of fighting and resisting, and the same with Ukraine. So how all these refugees settled in, but they brought their idea of home with them. And that kind of self-organization and resilience is a very powerful example of how world really functions.
That was Elena Korosteleva. To hear more from the University of Warwick's renowned team, check out the other episodes in this series at the Monocle Daily page at monocle.com. And do discover more about the University of Warwick at warwick.ac.uk. This was a special edition of the Monocle Daily, brought to you in association with the University of Warwick, the place for life's big questions.